In the last couple of lessons, we've taken a look as the United States used its large navy in the late 1800s to acquire territory in the Pacific, muscle its way into China, and defeat Spain. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at American foreign policy in the Caribbean. The United States acquired Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War from Spain. The Four-Acre Act shortly afterwards established a civil government there. We also learned in the last lesson that Cuba got its independence from Spain during the Spanish-American War with our help. The Platt Amendment is going to put some significant restrictions on Cuban independence. Specifically, it will give Cuba control over the island and domestic affairs internally in Cuba. However, Cuba is not going to be allowed to enter into any international treaty without our approval. This was to prevent foreign influence in Cuba, particularly military influence in Cuba. Additionally, we're going to reserve the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve order and maintain a government there. This was largely to protect our investments there. Additionally, we're going to build a naval base in Guantanamo Bay at this time, a base that is in fact still in Cuba. So we can see Cuba is going to have some significant restrictions, particularly as it relates to foreign policy actions. Theodore Roosevelt had become president on September 14, 1901, when President William McKinley was assassinated. One of the goals he wanted to do was to build a canal across Central America to be able to move American warships quickly between coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. In 1903, a treaty was signed with Colombia granting the United States use of the Isthmus of Panama, that you see being circled here, in exchange for financial compensation. The U.S. ratified the treaty, the Senate ratified the treaty, but the Colombian Senate, fearing a loss of sovereignty, refused. In response, President Roosevelt gave tacit approval to a rebellion by Panamanian nationalists. This rebellion began in November of 1903. To aid the rebels, the U.S.-administered railroad in Panama removed its trains, stranding Colombian troops sent to crush the insurrection. Other Colombian forces were discouraged from marching on Panama by the arrival of the U.S. warship Nashville and others that you see pictured there. On November 6, 1903, the United States recognized the Republic of Panama, and on November 18th, a treaty was signed with Panama granting the United States exclusive and permanent possession of the Panama Canal zone. In exchange, Panama received $10 million and an annuity of $250,000 beginning 9 years later. The treaty was negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay and the owner of the Panama Canal Company. You can see here that the canal took 10 years to construct. Initially, construction at the beginning was very slow going. That was due to the fact that many of the 35,000 construction workers that first started on the project began dying. And it was at this time that scientists figured out that it was actually the mosquito that was causing the malaria and yellow fever, the tropical diseases that people were getting sick and some of them dying by. Once they figured out it was a mosquito, they began draining the swamps, which are the breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and construction was able to really continue in earnest. This map shows the path of the canal through Panama, and you can see the two items here. The canal allowed U.S. to move naval ships quickly between oceans for protecting the Atlantic and the Pacific coast, and this was President Roosevelt's primary reason for constructing the canal. However, he clearly understood the commercial applications of the canal in that it was going to cut shipping time dramatically for goods coming from China to the East Coast or goods coming from Europe to the West Coast. You were going to cut off about 3 weeks travel time because boats no longer needed to go around the entire continent of South America. President Theodore Roosevelt took an assertive approach to Latin America and the Caribbean. This policy was known as the Big Stick policy, and in December of 1904 formalized in what was known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Quick reminder on the Monroe Doctrine: President James Monroe in 1823 told the nations of Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, specifically not to come back and recolonize their areas that had just become independent. Theodore Roosevelt is going to take a more aggressive approach, as can be seen from these cartoons. When Venezuela was fighting with its creditors, the people it owed money to, and the concern was default on Venezuela's part, particularly of particular concern was if European countries came into Venezuela. This issue prompts Roosevelt to issue his corollary, or addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which says essentially that the U.S. is going to invade any Latin American nation in order to keep the peace. So we are going to turn around and play regional policeman. And this map here indicates that we did just that. Interestingly, it was Roosevelt who issues the corollary, but it's a number of presidents after Roosevelt that actually... President William Taft, who follows Roosevelt, takes a slightly different approach. You see in the cartoon here, he's padding the big stick, meaning trying to take a softer approach. Taft's approach was known as dollar diplomacy, where he's encouraging Americans and American companies to invest in Latin America. The charts here indicate that there was a significant investment in Latin America at about 1914, receiving the lion's share of the money that was being invested by America outside of the United States. The chart on the right indicates the areas in which that investment was going into, mining being a large percentage, agriculture being probably the second largest percentage. Of course, with agriculture, we're talking about fruit, sugarcane, coffee, and the like. So then, to sum this lesson up, it should be fairly obvious that the U.S. was very actively involved in the Caribbean. Specifically, the Platt Amendment allowed the United States to control Cuban foreign policy. Even though we gave Cuba their independence, we did so with significant restrictions. The Panama Canal the purpose of the canal was to allow our Navy to move quickly between oceans, although there were certainly additional benefits to the canal. And the Roosevelt Corollary made the U.S. a regional policeman. We would invade Caribbean nations as we felt the need to, largely to protect our business interests there.